Okay, so Charles Stuart comes to power in 1660 until 1685, and he is invited back by the Convention Parliament. A Convention Parliament is a parliament not called by the monarch themselves. And this comes about because the Committee of Safety fall apart. After Oliver Cromwell died, we have the very short-lived rule of Richard Cromwell. The army remove him and take control themselves, which is the Committee of Safety. The Committee of Safety quickly lose control of England. There's rioting all over the country against the Committee of Safety. We then have Monk, who is up in Scotland. He's English, he's a member of the English army, but he's been up in Scotland, kind of keeping the peace up there. Because during the interregnum, the Scottish rebelled. So he's been up there. And he raises his own, sort of, takes the troops he's got in Scotland, and they march down into England to get rid of the Committee of Safety. There's no public support for the Committee of Safety. There is massive public support for the Restoration by this point. They liked having a leader under Oliver Cromwell, and when he died, they desire another leader. And the only person that kind of the public can really see as a leader is Charles Stuart. Monk wants to restore Charles Stuart, but doesn't have the authority. So he decides to call the rump back. Seeing the rump as, the last kind of parliament who were, because obviously the rump were the ones who executed Charles I, and he sees them as that they have some kind of authority. So he calls the rump back, but they aren't really playing ball. They sort of start talking about just taking power from themselves again. So he then calls the Long Parliament back. So the Long Parliament were the original Parliament who went to war against Charles I, and they became the rump when most of them were excluded during Pride's Purge. So he calls the rump back. They won't do what he wants. Then he calls the Long Parliament back, and the Long Parliament have the authority to officially dissolve themselves and call elections for a Convention Parliament to restore Charles II. And that's what happens. The Long Parliament are dissolved by themselves. They call fresh elections. They organise elections. A Convention Parliament is elected. And the job of that Convention Parliament is to restore Charles II. And although Monk couldn't do any of that himself, he's the one who engineered it with the support of the public. Because when Monk was coming down from Scotland with the troops and the Committee of Safety, Lambert wanted to fight back. Lambert was an army member, member of the Committee of Safety, and he does want to fight back. But the morale is broken by that point. His army desert him, and there is no kind of fight back against this. And Monk, with the support of the public, huge public support for restoration. And then we have the rump, the Long Parliament, dissolved, the Convention Parliament, and they are the ones who invite Charles II back. And there is just massive public support for this. Charles also helps himself because he releases the Declaration of Breda. Breda is just a town in the Netherlands where he was at that point. And he announces through the Declaration of Breda that he, if he was to come back, he would abide by the rules of the country, and he would rule with a parliament, and he would pardon everybody, and he would, just basically be a good king that they wanted him to be. But they already wanted him back. The Declaration of Breda just kind of helps him get invited back. Now, when he comes back to England, there's huge public support for restoration because they're all just kind of fed up with the chaos of the interregnum and fed up of the army kind of taking over. And they just want that kind of safety and security of a king back. So Charles comes back, and the Convention Parliament that had been elected offer him the Restoration Settlement. And this basically just gives him all of the powers of the monarch back. The power to sort of run the country on a day-to-day basis as the monarch, the head of the country. It gives him his financial powers back, which is he could collect ordinary revenue, but for any extra money, he would have to go to Parliament. And it returns him as the head of the Church of England and gets rid of religious freedom. So it brings back the Restoration Settlement, brings back one church, one Anglican Protestant church with the monarch as the head. The monarch is there as the kind of in charge of the country, and Parliament's job going back to granting extra subsidies as well as passing any new laws. So any new laws would have to be passed by the monarch and Parliament together. So all of those things are how they used to be. So the Restoration Settlement really was restoring the power of the monarch to how it was before the Civil War. Also part of the Restoration Settlement is the Act of Indemnity and Oblivion. This basically just pardons everybody who did anything during the English Civil War. The only people who would be executed would be people who had signed Charles's death certificate, death warrant. So the order to execute him. So they are people known as the regicides, and they're the only people that would be punished. And actually, most of them are dead by this point anyway. People like Cromwell are dead by this point. But generally, it's kind of a blanket pardon to anyone who'd done anything against Charles I, except sign his death warrants. Shortly after the Restoration Settlement as well, we have the Militia Acts and the Triennial Act. So the Militia Acts say that Charles II would be in charge of the army and the navy, just as he had been before. So just as the monarch had been before. And the Triennial Act changes the old Triennial Act to make it a little bit less harsh. The original Triennial Act that Charles I signed said that Parliament had to be called every 3 years. This new Triennial Act that was signed by Charles II and agreed by Charles II just said that it was a suggestion that the monarch would have a Parliament every 3 years rather than automatic. So generally, the Restoration Settlement is really, really positive for Charles II. It really gives him those powers back. We then go into the Cavalier Parliament. Now, the Cavalier Parliament lasts for 18 years, so it covers most of Charles II's reign. And within the Cavalier Parliament, we have 3 advisors. The first being Clarendon. And kind of the Clarendon years show a lot of kind of harmony between the monarch and Parliament. But also obviously some issues. Now, Clarendon very much wanted to work with Parliament, and he is the advisor that wants to try and please the most people and thinks that Charles should compromise. So one of the big compromises that Charles is advised to make by Clarendon is the Clarendon Code, which removes all religious freedom for both dissenters and Catholics. It brings in things like the Quaker Act, which led to the imprisonment of hundreds of Quakers, and the Conventicle Act, which said that you couldn't have any religious meetings except Anglican meetings at the official Church of England. So the Clarendon Code is a number of different laws, but together they abolish any religious freedom. And that isn't actually what Charles wanted. Charles II wanted religious freedom, at least for dissenters. He understood that no one would accept religious freedom for Catholics, but he wanted religious freedom for dissenters. But Clarendon made him realise he had to go with Parliament because Parliament really wanted the Clarendon Code. And therefore Charles compromises and brings it in. He does then have some issues with dissenters. Generally, Charles II is accepted. You know, people were so fed up with what had happened after Cromwell's death that they're just desperate for the monarchy back, and there's very little opposition to him. But we do have some opposition from the millenarians. So the fifth monarchists and the millenarians, due to the Clarendon Code, obviously their religions are banned. So we have Venner's Rising and the Northern Rising, and these are both risings from millenarians and fifth monarchists, kind of uprisings against Charles II, because obviously they can't have religious freedom. These are dealt with quite easily by Charles II. He uses his army to squish them, and they lead to some executions and also show trials. So we have people like Thomas Harrison, who had been a member of the army and was the fifth monarchist, who was, you know, the famous fifth monarchist from the Barebones Parliament. He is put on show trial and executed for his involvement in these uprisings. And by show trial, I mean kind of public trials. And the idea is they're a deterrent, a warning to others not to go against him. So although there is this opposition to him, he deals with it well, but the whole religious thing is a compromise for Charles. Now, something else that he has to deal with in the 1660s is the Great Fire of London, and then the Great Plague outbreak in London as well. And both of these things, you know, are costly and take a lot of time and energy to deal with. And, you know, he basically, the whole of, you know, over sort of half of London has to be rebuilt after the Great Fire. So this is a huge source of you know, outgoings for Charles. Money, not just obviously linked to those events, but money is probably one of the biggest causes of tension between Charles and Parliament at this time. It's not religion, but his spending is out of control. He gets himself, under the Clarendon years, he gets himself into about £1 million of debt. He lives a very hedonistic lifestyle, you know, luxury parties, women, clothes. You know, he spends too much. The trade also isn't going very well in these years. It's not a great time for trade. Parliament do give him a new source of ordinary revenue, which is the hearth tax, a tax on fireplaces, but it doesn't really help. It doesn't bring in enough money to help him with his debts. And actually, one of the biggest causes of debt at this time is war. And Parliament are furious with his spending on war, absolutely furious. And hence they bring in a supply bill, which allows them to scrutinise his spending during the Second Anglo-Dutch War, because they just don't trust him. And they are just so critical of his spending during that war. So that's one source of tension. The other source of tension is foreign policy. He marries Catherine of Braganza, so she is she's a Portuguese Catholic, so that's why this causes problems with Parliament, because she's Portuguese. Now, some really positive things about that marriage are she brings a £500,000 dowry, and England gains new colonies from it as well. We have Tangier, which is in North Africa, and Bombay, which is in India. So there's loads of positives, but she is Catholic, and she never has a child, which obviously causes lots of problems. And also this marriage leads to England having to help Portugal on a number of occasions as well. But the bigger thing is the Second Anglo-Dutch War. At first, this is supported by Parliament. Parliament support it because the idea of the Second Anglo-Dutch War is to actually improve English trade, give us better access to trade in the East Indies, prevent Dutch you know, ships being able to trade in English ports. So the kind of the sort of reasons for the Second Anglo-Dutch War are supported by Parliament, and they do provide money for the Second Anglo-Dutch War to begin with. They provide funds, over £1 million of funds. However, the Second Anglo-Dutch War is an absolute failure. And the battles that England get involved with are an absolute disaster. And the kind of really embarrassing part of the Second Anglo-Dutch War is that the Dutch raid up the River Medway into England and managed to steal the Royal Charles, kind of the main warship of England, and they steal it. And that's such a humiliation for Charles. But the battles of the Second Anglo-Dutch War really do not go the English way. And they, it's a massive loss, and they have to basically surrender, and which is the Treaty of Breda. Now, this treaty, they don't really get much out of it. They get New York and New Jersey confirmed as being English, but they already were English. But the Dutch accept that they control New York and New Jersey. But apart from that, they don't gain anything else that they wanted, such as, trying to steal Dutch colonies and things like that. So we move on to the Cabal because Clarendon is the one blamed for the Second Anglo-Dutch War, which was really not fair because actually it really wasn't his fault, because he was against it all along. He was the one that actually wanted them to stay out of the war, and Clarendon warned Charles II against getting involved in that war. And yet at the end, when the Second Anglo-Dutch War is a massive failure, it's actually Clarendon who gets blamed, and then he gets impeached by Parliament for his role in the Second Anglo-Dutch War. But it's really harsh. It's not really very fair, because it was not his fault. Instead, when Clarendon is gone, he is replaced by the Cabal. So the Cabal are Clifford, Ashley, Buckingham, Arlington, and Lauderdale. They are 5 different advisors, and they couldn't be more different to Clarendon. Clarendon was all about trying to keep the peace with Parliament, and sometimes Charles didn't listen to him. So Clarendon had tried to keep Charles's spending low, and Charles didn't listen. Clarendon had warned him against the Second Anglo-Dutch War, and he hadn't listened to him. But he had listened to him about religion. The Cabal, though, they actually advised Charles to go the opposite way and bring in religious freedom. Some of the members of the Cabal are Catholics and dissenters, and they strongly believe in religious freedom and advise Charles to go with religious freedom. So the first thing that Charles does is refuses to renew the Conventicle Act. It was about to expire. It only had a certain life. And Parliament obviously wanted to renew it, because if the Conventicle Act expired, then non-Anglican religious meetings would be allowed. And Charles refuses to renew it, because he obviously wants to allow non-Anglican religious meetings. Parliament eventually forced him to renew it by threatening to not give him any money, and he was desperate for money at that point. Later, Charles then brings in the Declaration of Indulgence. This is bigger because this said that all religious freedom was brought in, because the Declaration of Indulgence suspended, because this is him using his suspending powers, suspended all of the Clarendon Code. Parliament are obviously furious. They see that Charles is not only bringing in religious freedom, and that would have been for Catholics and dissenters, but they think he's abusing his suspending powers by suspending a whole host of laws all in one go. So the Declaration of Indulgence was brought in 73. However, Charles was at war again by that point with the Third Anglo-Dutch War and desperately needed money, and therefore Parliament forced him to bring in the Test Act. This, and also get rid of the Declaration of Indulgence. So the Declaration of Indulgence had temporarily got rid of all of the Clarendon Code, but he withdraws the Declaration of Indulgence, which reinstates the Clarendon Code, and he also brings in the Test Act, which said that you could not have anyone except Anglicans in any position of power, in the Privy Council, in Parliament, as JPs. So actually, in the end, Charles reduces religious freedom even further after the Test Act in 73. So Declaration of Indulgence was 72, Test Act was 73. And the other thing that obviously is annoying them is that Charles uses his dispensing powers to allow his brother to be Catholic. So he uses suspending powers in 73 to bring in the Declaration of Indulgence. Sorry, in 72, apologies. 72 was the Declaration of Indulgence, 73 was the Test Act. And then he uses his dispensing powers to allow his brother James to practice as a Catholic. So religion, unlike under the Clarendon years, religion under the Cabal causes huge problems with Parliament. We then have obviously religion, but we have finance also causing problems. So what we have is Charles, by this point, is in £2 million of debt, and Parliament persuade him to bring in the rule of specific sanction. And this means that all his spending has to go through the Treasury. Now, that is not Parliament. The Treasury is part of his Privy Council. So it would be just giving more power to his Privy Council to keep an eye over him. So the rule of specific sanction basically is just hoping that his own financial ministers will keep a bit better eye on his spending. He also has to stop the exchequer during the Cabal years. This is when he can't afford to pay back his loans that he owes to banks. So he just stops paying back his loans for a year. So temporarily, this helps him with his debt, but in the long run, it makes him worse because those banks then charge him more interest than they would have done before. I've also just written there 8,000 guards. This just because his was his example of his out of control spending. He had to pay 8,000 guards. Well, he didn't have to. He shouldn't have had that many guards. It's just his extravagant spending. So once again, finance causing problems. But this rule of specific sanction is kind of a compromise that he makes with Parliament to try and get them to support him a bit more, to show, no, look, it's not just me, my Treasury are keeping an eye on me. Foreign policy, though, once again, creates endless problems. And what we see is Charles going against the will of Parliament, because what Parliament want him to do is sign the Triple Alliance with the Dutch and the Swedish. And that's what he does. Now, that was a Protestant alliance. It's kind of alliance against France. But that isn't obviously what Charles wanted, because Charles actually is desperate for an alliance with France. So why on earth would he sign the Triple Alliance? He tries this alliance with the Dutch and the Swedish, but he secretly wants an alliance with the French. And he's trying to basically persuade the French to come to him by signing an alliance with somebody else. Because when France see that the Dutch and the Swedish and the English are all together, that might make the French want to tempt England away onto their side. And that's exactly what happens, because Charles soon persuades the French to sign the Treaty of Dover with him, as well as the secret Treaty of Dover. But no one knows about that at the time, because it takes 100 years for anyone to find out about that. Now, the Treaty of Dover says that the French and the English will go to war again against the Dutch and then when they win, they'll share the Dutch colonies between them. And this is what happened. And then also the French will give England money to do this. And this is what happens. The English then break the Triple Alliance, join with the French, and the Third Anglo-Dutch War begins. And once again, it's an absolute failure. Even though the French provided £800,000 to the English to go to war, it all goes wrong. Their even their admiral is killed. So the admiral is like the leader of the English navy. He's killed, and the English naval fleet are defeated near a place called Texel. So that's Texel. This then leads to the English having to surrender and sign the Treaty of Westminster. All they get from the Treaty of Westminster is sort of fishing rights in the North Sea. They don't actually gain any colonies, and they obviously lose their French alliance as well, because when the English surrender, that leaves the French still at war with the Dutch on their own. So England has lost this Third Anglo-Dutch War. England are in massive debt, and Charles has lost his French alliance, which is all he wanted. He sees kind of France as the ultimate monarchy. He sees France as what he wants to be with, and he wants to be like, and he's lost his alliance. This also then leads to the fall of the Cabal, because some of them get impeached by Parliament for their role in the Third Anglo-Dutch War, and then Charles kind of fires some of them as well, and we have some resignations. So this leads to the fall of the Cabal. We then go into the final and again probably more harmonious time under Danby. Danby is more like Clarendon in that he advises Charles to stick with the Clarendon Code. Charles really can't be controlled very much over foreign policy, as we've seen, because he didn't listen to Clarendon over foreign policy. He did listen to the Cabal, but the Cabal were the ones supporting him to do things like sign the Treaty of Dover. The secret Treaty of Dover as well, I forgot to mention, under the Cabal, the secret Treaty of Dover, which no one knew about, was the agreement that Charles would turn England Catholic. But he doesn't actually do that, and no one actually finds out. But under Danby, we have the return to the Clarendon Code. We have no attempts by Charles in this period, in this bit of the Danby years of the Cavalier Parliament, to bring in any more religious freedom. So that obviously creates more harmony because the Clarendon Code is in place. We do have, however, a surge in anti-Catholicism again. Throughout this time, people had more been fearing dissenters. It was more fear of Quakers and fear of millenarians. But the Popish plot once again reminds people of that anti-Catholic fear. The Popish plot, which was in 1678, was made up. It was the fiction of this man called Titus Oates, who was super Anglican and a bit deranged, and he said that he'd uncovered this plot to kill Charles II, put his brother James on the throne, and bring back Catholicism. It was completely made up, but people believed it. And especially when a Protestant is killed, a Protestant who'd sort of been investigating the Popish plot is killed, and obviously there's mass hysteria and anti-Catholicism. This then leads to Charles having to execute 35 Catholics for their involvement in the plot, even though he knew the plot wasn't real. And the sort of people who are executed, a man named Coleman, who was the secretary of James Stewart. He's his secretary, and he was found to be in communication with the Pope, not about killing anybody, not about overthrowing Charles II, but because he's seen to be in contact with the Pope, and obviously he works for Charles. If he works for James, he has to be executed. Um, I think Charles II deals with the Popish plot really well, considering. Um, he could have just gone, look, it's a load of nonsense, and tried to ignore it. But he reads the public and he understands that actually the public believe that that it's real, and therefore he has to be seen to be cracking down on the Catholics. And that's what he does, and he executes 35 of them. So religion is a bit of an issue, but not from because of what he's done. He is actually, Parliament praise him for his actions in supporting the Clarendon Code and dealing with the Popish plot harshly. Unfortunately, it does directly lead to the exclusion crisis, which I have talked to you about in a separate video. There is some improvements to finance in this time, which is the customs duty. This is Danby. Danby is responsible for this. He reforms the collection of customs duties and makes them collected directly by Crown employees. This means that there's much less corruption and more of the customs duties end up in the pocket of the Crown instead of the kind of local tax collectors. There's also a trade boom at this time. So because trade is increasing, so is the income of the monarch. It increases to around £1.4 million a year. So that's much better than under the Clarendon years. Under the Clarendon years, some years, Charles was only collecting around £600,000, whereas by this point, he's more than doubled that. So the income is increasing, but unfortunately, his debt is also still going up at this point, mainly because he owes money to banks and therefore the interest on those loans goes up all of the time, but also his spending is still out of control. Now, the Danby years is also when we have the emergence of the court and country parties, these kind of political groupings within Parliament. The country party are those who oppose some of the things that Charles is doing, such as they're against religious freedom, they're against being allied with the French. And we also have the court party, who are within Charles's Privy Council, but also they have some members in Parliament. And again, these are the people who are more on the side of Charles, and they support his foreign policy and support his religious policy. So we see this split in Parliament, and obviously the majority of Parliament are either the country party or just kind of neutral, moderate, somewhere in the middle. And then we have a small number of MPs who are court MPs. And then we have obviously the court party within the Privy Council. But it's that beginning of that kind of party politics and having two rival parties within Parliament. One of the biggest causes of tension, once again, under the Danby years, still within the Cavalier Parliament, is his foreign policy. Charles is persuaded by Danby and by Parliament to sign the Anglo-Dutch agreement. Now, we know this isn't really what Charles wanted. This is the second time he's kind of made a promise to the Dutch. And what he agrees is that he will send 30,000 soldiers to force France to surrender. Because after the Third Anglo-Dutch War, which was England and France against the Dutch, England withdrew, but France are still fighting the Dutch. So this would be then, not only has England and Charles lost his French alliance, he would then be sending an army to force the French to end the war and surrender. He does this. He actually does this. So he does threaten the French with his 30,000 soldiers. And France back down, and they actually do make peace with the Dutch. So this is what Danby wanted, this is what Parliament wanted, this is what the Dutch wanted. It actually all goes to plan. Parliament are happy they've provided £1 million to pay for these 30,000 soldiers, and it works. There's peace, and the Dutch and the French stop their war. However, what is discovered by all parties is that while all this was going on, Charles actually had a dual policy, and all this time he was still trying to get another alliance with the French, even though he actually did what he was meant to. He was actually going back behind the back of everybody and talking to the French and saying, oh, well, I've made this agreement with the Dutch, but actually I'm quite happy to abandon that and come back on your side if you'll have me. So that's why it's called the dual policy. And even though nothing comes of that, and he doesn't actually manage to make another alliance with the French, all the parties find out about this. So Parliament are furious that he was trying to, and the Dutch are both furious that he was actually still trying to make an alliance with the French while being on the side of the Dutch. Now, I advise you, because obviously I know I've tried to go over foreign policy here, but that's one of the more complicated and in-depth things for Charles II. So I advise you to go back to your foreign policy notes that you've got and look at them in a lot of detail, because obviously I've just given you an overview, but the foreign policy is one of the most complicated bits of Charles II. So please make sure that you know that really clearly. Now, after all of that is done, Parliament try and impeach Danby. But the problem for Charles is that Danby knows about the secret Treaty of Dover. And he's worried that if Danby is impeached, he will reveal that. So instead of letting Parliament impeach Danby, he decides to end the Cavalier Parliament, not to save Danby, but just to keep his secrets. It doesn't really work, and Danby is actually impeached by a later parliament. One of the exclusion parliaments actually goes ahead and impeaches Danby, and he doesn't reveal Charles's secrets, and he spends 5 years in prison. So throughout the Cavalier Parliament, Charles sacrificed Clarendon, who's impeached. He sacrificed the cabal, and he was sacrifices Danby, who's also eventually impeached. He sort of lets them take the blame for the things that he does wrong. Now, following the end of the Cavalier Parliament, we have the exclusion crisis, which I talk about in a different video.